On December 3, 2016, patrol officers found an abandoned 1992 Oldsmobile running on the shoulder of the Route 35 bridge in Belmar, New Jersey. The keys were still in the ignition. The owner, 19-year-old Sarah Stern, was gone. It looked like a textbook suicide, a tragic leap into the freezing currents of the Shark River, but the water below held no body. The real horror wasn't in the river. It was wearing the face of her childhood best friend, who had timed her execution on his phone. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Neptune City sits on the New Jersey coastline, a working-class borough where the salt air strips the paint off coastal homes and the winters bite with a damp, freezing wind. It was here that Sarah Stern navigated the turbulent transition between adolescence and adulthood. She was an artist at her core, a young woman who viewed her surroundings almost entirely through the lens of a camera. She spent her days producing independent YouTube videos, sketching, and dreaming of a career in digital media. Her energy was magnetic, if somewhat erratic. She drove a fading 1992 Oldsmobile 88, preferred oversized hoodies, and possessed a deeply trusting nature that naturally drew marginalized kids into her orbit. But beneath that vibrant, creative exterior lay a profound and lingering grief. In 2013, her world fractured permanently. Her mother, Laura, lost a brutal, exhausting battle with melanoma. Sarah was only 16 when the foundation of her life collapsed. Her father, Michael, did everything he could to maintain a sense of stability and normalcy in their home, but the absence of a mother left Sarah searching for an emotional anchor. She clung heavily to her closest peers, elevating them from casual high school friends to a surrogate family. She desperately needed protectors and confidants, people who could ground her when the trauma of her mother's death felt too heavy to carry alone. 3 years later, another family death would inadvertently set a horrific chain of events into motion. By late 2016, Sarah's grandmother had passed away, leaving behind a vacant property in the nearby coastal town of Avon by the Sea. The residence was located just a few miles down the road, a quiet house filled with decades of accumulated belongings. Sarah was tasked with helping her father clear out the estate. It was a tedious, dusty process, sorting through heavy wooden dressers, forgotten financial documents, and rooms thick with the scent of mothballs and aging paper. During this excavation, she found a locked metal box shoved into the back of a closet. When she finally managed to pry the lid open, she didn't find old photographs or worthless costume jewelry. The box was packed tight with cash. These were not crisp, modern banknotes. It was a massive hoard of vintage currency, 50s and 100s dating back decades, their paper brittle and smelling strongly of mildew and old ink. The exact amount was difficult to verify immediately, but it was staggering. Sarah estimated the windfall to be anywhere from $10,000 to nearly $100,000. For a 19-year-old surviving on minimum wage shifts, this was not just a lucky find, it was a lifeline. The money represented absolute, immediate freedom. Sarah immediately began formulating an exit strategy. She researched packing up her Oldsmobile and crossing the border to Canada to start over, or perhaps driving 3,000 miles west to California to launch her own media production company. The brittle vintage bills were her ticket out of the grief-stricken corridors of her New Jersey life. Her fatal mistake was viewing the world through a lens of absolute trust. Sarah did not possess a secretive bone in her body. Overwhelmed by the adrenaline of the discovery, she did exactly what any excited teenager would do. She broadcasted her luck. She took a portion of the cash to her local bank, attempting to deposit the older bills, only to be informed by the teller that the severely dated currency could not be processed locally and required routing through the Federal Reserve. Frustrated but undeterred, she took the money back home, transferring the fortune into 2 separate shoeboxes, which she slid under her bed. She shared the secret of the shoeboxes with the 2 boys she trusted most in the world. She believed she was sharing a miracle with her brothers. She had no comprehension that she had just placed a bounty on her own head. Sarah did not just stumble into a friendship with Liam McAtasney and Preston Taylor. Their bond was forged during the vulnerable, formative years of early adolescence. They were a trio tightly knit by proximity and shared coastal routines. Liam was the gregarious one, a teenager who knew exactly how to command a room, masking any deeper insecurities with a loud, confident exterior. Preston was quieter, a follower by nature, someone who naturally gravitated toward Liam's relentless pull. Sarah viewed both of them not just as peers, but as fundamental pillars of her shrinking world. They navigated the awkward transitions of high school together, attending the same basement parties and driving aimlessly along the shoreline. Preston even accompanied Sarah to her junior prom, a gesture that cemented his role as a trusted confidant in the eyes of her father. When the sickness finally claimed her mother, it was Liam and Preston who formed the protective perimeter around her. They were the ones she cried to in the dark, the ones who provided a distraction when the silence in her house became utterly suffocating. In her mind, they were surrogate brothers. The idea that either of them could harbor malice toward her was fundamentally incomprehensible. But proximity to trauma can sometimes breed a twisted sense of entitlement. While she leaned on them for emotional survival, Liam began to view their dynamic through a highly transactional lens. He was notoriously focused on status and quick financial independence, often vocalizing his deep frustration over working menial, low-wage jobs. He wanted a shortcut. When Sarah pulled those shoeboxes out from under her bed and exposed the vintage currency, the foundational nature of their relationship simply evaporated. For the grieving daughter, sharing the secret was an act of profound vulnerability. For Liam, it was a financial audit. He did not see a fragile friend holding a delicate lifeline. He saw an unguarded vault. He later described his thought process in entirely clinical, detached terms. He noted the exact dimensions of the security lockbox she eventually purchased to house the cash. He calculated the weight of the steel. He estimated the total yield. The money became a psychological parasite that completely overwrote a decade of trust. He knew he could not execute an extraction of that magnitude alone. He needed logistical support, and he knew exactly who possessed the moral flexibility to assist him. Preston was currently sharing an apartment with Liam, their lives intertwined by a lease and a long-established hierarchy where Liam dictated every term. The conversations between the two roommates did not begin with murder. They started with hypothetical grievances about fairness. Liam planted seeds of resentment, suggesting that their friend was careless with her newfound wealth, that she did not appreciate the true value of what she had pulled from the dusty closet. He rationalized the theft by framing the cash as discarded, forgotten property that rightfully belonged to whoever possessed the ambition to take it. Preston absorbed this twisted logic without a single point of resistance. He was promised a cut of exactly $3,000. It was a pitifully low figure to place on a human life, but enough to secure his absolute complicity. The plan evolved organically in the dark confines of their shared apartment. What began as a burglary scheme morphed into something terminal. Liam reasoned that if they simply stole the lockbox, she would immediately point the authorities in their direction, given she had only shown the money to a handful of people. The only way to guarantee a clean getaway was to ensure the sole witness could never speak to a detective. The transition from theoretical plotting to active hunting was remarkably swift and deeply predatory. Liam began stalking his childhood protector, mapping out her daily routines. He noted when her father left for work, calculating the exact windows of total residential isolation. He even visited her house under the guise of casual hangouts, secretly analyzing the layout of the property, measuring the distance from the front door to the street, and testing the structural integrity of the lockbox. He was meticulously cold. He discussed the mechanics of strangulation with his roommate, researching precisely how long it would take a human brain to succumb to oxygen deprivation. He set a timer on his phone, visualizing the violent process. He needed to know exactly how many minutes he would have to endure the physical struggle before her heart stopped beating. They also plotted the disposal. The Route 35 bridge crossing the Shark River was selected for its impressive height and its freezing, rapid currents. A jump from that elevation would easily be classified as a tragic suicide, perfectly aligning with her known history of severe depression following her mother's death. Liam intended to weaponize her psychological trauma, using her deepest scars as the ultimate alibi. In the weeks leading up to the ambush, He maintained a flawless, terrifying facade. He texted her regularly, hung out in her living room, and offered emotional support, all while carrying the blueprint for her execution in his pocket. He was completely devoid of the typical anxieties that accompany premeditated crimes. There was no hesitation, no crisis of conscience. He viewed the impending violence as a necessary administrative step to access capital. He dictated to Preston precisely what his role would be. The subordinate was instructed to wait by a two-way radio, ready to extract the heavy lockbox and drive the getaway vehicles. The delegation of tasks was handled like a mundane shift schedule at a fast food restaurant. They were two teenagers dissecting a human life into logistical bullet points. Meanwhile, the target remained completely oblivious to the predator sitting on her couch. She continued to plan her cross-country escape, eagerly discussing her itinerary with the very person tasked with ensuring she never left the state. She trusted him with her future, her fears, and her entire life savings, unaware that he had already started the timer on his phone. December 2nd was a Friday. The temperature along the New Jersey coast hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with a damp, biting wind blowing in off the Atlantic. It was the kind of gray, overcast afternoon that forced people indoors, leaving the residential streets of Neptune City largely empty. Inside a cramped apartment, a plan transitioned into active execution. The two young men synchronized their movements. The primary aggressor slipped a pair of cheap, disposable walkie-talkies into his jacket. He instructed his roommate to monitor Channel 4 and to wait for a specific signal. If the radio cracked to life, it meant the physical act was finished and the extraction phase needed to begin. The subordinate nodded, taking his position on the couch, entirely willing to wait out a murder from the comfort of his living room. The walk to the target's house took less than 10 minutes. The perpetrator texted ahead, manufacturing a casual excuse to stop by. He claimed he just wanted to hang out, maybe watch a movie and catch up. The victim, completely isolated in the quiet house while her father was away on a business trip, welcomed the company. She unlocked the front door and let her childhood friend inside. The living room was warm. The television hummed in the background. She settled onto the couch, turning her attention to the screen, completely relaxed in her own home. The predator sat beside her. He did not immediately strike. He allowed the mundane atmosphere to stretch on for several minutes, casually watching the television, monitoring the street out the front window for any passing cars. He was waiting for absolute silence. He needed to ensure no delivery drivers were walking up the driveway. He needed the perimeter to be entirely secure. When he finally moved, there was no argument. There was no sudden confrontation or shouted threat. The transition to violence was instantaneous. He lunged. He wrapped his forearm tightly around her neck from behind. He locked his grip. He applied maximum pressure to the carotid artery. The victim fought back violently. Survival instinct took over. She clawed at his arms, kicking her legs against the coffee table, gasping for a breath that would not come. The family dog, sensing the sheer terror in the room, began barking wildly, circling the violent struggle on the carpet. The attacker did not panic. He did not loosen his hold. With his free hand, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen and started the digital stopwatch. He wanted to measure the exact duration of an execution. The physical struggle was brutal and chaotic. He dragged her off the couch, using his body weight to pin her against the floorboards. The kicking slowed. Her hands dropped. The desperate, frantic clawing at his skin lost its strength. The digital numbers on the phone screen ticked upward. 1 minute, 2 minutes. He held the chokehold. He watched the timer. He maintained the crushing pressure long after her body went entirely limp, clinical, and detached, ensuring the physiological process of asphyxiation was irreversible. When the stopwatch hit 30 minutes, he finally released his grip. The room was dead silent, save for the whining of the dog. The target was eliminated. The only witness was gone. He stood up, his muscles aching from the prolonged exertion. He did not call his accomplice immediately. The logistics of a midday disposal were too risky. The sun was still up, and neighbors could easily look out their windows. Instead, he grabbed the lifeless body by the arms. He dragged her out the back door, pulling her across the freezing patio. He shoved her deep into the dense, overgrown bushes bordering the property line, covering her with loose dirt and dead branches. Then, he went to the bathroom. He washed his face. He checked his neck for scratches. He had a scheduled shift at his job, and he intended to clock in. He walked away from the house, leaving his best friend dead in the dirt, and spent the next several hours working a standard shift. He interacted with coworkers. He served customers. He maintained a perfectly flat, unremarkable demeanor. He used his employment as a rock-solid, verifiable alibi for the afternoon, operating with a level of compartmentalization that seasoned detectives would later find utterly chilling. When the shift ended in the evening, the operation resumed. He keyed the walkie-talkie. The signal was sent. The accomplice arrived at the property under the cover of darkness. The two men entered the empty house and immediately headed for the bedroom. The objective was the heavy steel lockbox. They pulled it from its hiding spot. It weighed close to 50 pounds, a dense metal cube packed with vintage, brittle currency. They carried it out the front door, loading it into the trunk of their vehicle. They did not stop to count the yield. The physical evidence of the body still needed to be addressed. They moved to the backyard. The air was frigid now, the temperature dropping sharply toward freezing. They pulled the victim from the brush. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in, making the body stiff and incredibly difficult to maneuver. They needed her own car for the staging. The faded 1992 Oldsmobile 88 was parked in the driveway. They opened the passenger door and shoved her into the front seat, buckling the seatbelt to keep her upright. The convoy mobilized just before midnight. The plan required precision driving. The mastermind took the wheel of the Oldsmobile, sitting mere inches from the corpse of the girl who had trusted him. The accomplice followed closely behind in a separate vehicle. They navigated the dark, winding coastal roads, heading directly toward the Route 35 bridge in Belmar. The traffic was non-existent. The streets were black ribbons of asphalt cutting through the sleeping coastal towns. They reached the crest of the bridge. The structure arched high over the Shark River, a 50-foot drop into fast-moving, icy currents leading out to the Atlantic Ocean. The mastermind pulled the Oldsmobile onto the narrow shoulder and slammed the transmission into park. He left the engine idling. He left the keys dangling in the ignition. The two men moved with frantic, terrified speed. The exposure on the elevated bridge was massive. Any passing patrol cruiser would see them instantly. They opened the passenger door. They unbuckled the belt. They grabbed the victim by the arms and legs, hauling her dead weight out of the cabin. The coastal wind whipped across the concrete span, freezing their hands as they dragged her toward the steel railing. They hoisted her up. The body was heavy, awkward, and rigid. They balanced her on the cold metal for a fraction of a second before pushing her forward. She fell silently into the darkness. There was a distant, heavy splash as she hit the black water below. The current grabbed her immediately, pulling her out toward the ocean. The men didn't wait to watch her sink. They sprinted to the secondary vehicle, throwing themselves into the cabin. The tires screeched against the asphalt as they sped away from the bridge, leaving the idling Oldsmobile behind. They returned to their apartment. They locked the door. They placed the heavy steel safe on the living room table, and finally pried it open. The vintage bills spilled out onto the cheap wood grain. They spent the early hours of the morning counting the blood money, entirely convinced they had just executed the perfect crime. The idling engine of the fading sedan was the first anomaly that caught the attention of the passing patrol unit. It was the early, freezing hours of a Saturday morning. The elevated span crossing the river was entirely deserted, save for the vehicle parked haphazardly on the southbound shoulder. The hazard lights were dark. The driver's side door was shut but unlocked. The keys remained in the ignition, the engine emitting a low, steady hum against the coastal wind. Inside, the cabin was empty. Officers immediately ran the plates. The registration returned a local address just a few miles away. The patrolman leaned over the thick concrete barrier, shining high-powered tactical flashlights into the churning black water 50 feet below, searching for surface disturbances or the bright color of a winter coat. There was nothing but the relentless, foaming pull of the tide rushing out toward the Atlantic Ocean. Within hours, the quiet borough was jolted awake by the arrival of unmarked cruisers. Investigators knocked on the front door of the family home. The father, having just returned from his out-of-town trip, was met with the kind of news that permanently paralyzes a parent. He was told his vehicle had been located abandoned on a bridge notorious for fatal jumps. The authorities needed to know her state of mind. The immediate working theory adopted by law enforcement was agonizingly straightforward. A young artist, carrying the profound, unresolved trauma of losing her mother, had driven to the highest point in the county and surrendered to the freezing currents. It was a clean, logical narrative that required no complex forensic breakdown, but the father's intuition rebelled aggressively against the clinical assessment. He insisted she had been making concrete plans. She was looking toward the future, organizing a cross-country move, and sketching out a new life. The framework of a sudden suicide simply did not fit the forward momentum she had been actively building. Despite his protests, the mechanics of a massive recovery operation were initiated. Dive teams suited up in heavy thermal neoprene, plunging into the brutal 39-degree water. Visibility beneath the surface was virtually non-existent, reduced to a murky, swirling brown. Divers relied entirely on tactile navigation, feeling their way along the muddy, debris-filled riverbed, fighting against a rip current that constantly threatened to pull them out to sea. Above them, Coast Guard helicopters chopped through the gray winter sky, flying low grid patterns over the inlet, while Marine units dragged high-frequency sonar equipment across the harbor floor. Days dragged into weeks. The water yielded absolutely nothing. As the official search expanded, the social echo within the tight-knit community grew deafening. The coastal towns mobilized with a frantic grassroots energy. Thousands of residents who had never even spoken to the missing teenager began printing stacks of flyers. They taped them to the glass doors of local diners, stapled them to utility poles, and handed them out to drivers at red lights. Digital campaigns multiplied across social networks, tracking alleged sightings that led nowhere. The psychological atmosphere of the town shifted from routine winter quiet to a suffocating communal dread. Right in the center of this mobilization were the two men who had orchestrated the nightmare. The mastermind did not retreat into the shadows or avoid the spotlight. Instead, he embedded himself perfectly within the epicenter of the grieving community. He adopted the flawless persona of a devastated, desperate friend. He showed up at the house, standing shoulder to shoulder with the shattered father. He offered a comforting physical presence, pouring coffee for relatives, fielding phone calls, and helping coordinate civilian search parties. He walked the icy beaches, bundled in a heavy winter coat, pretending to scan the horizon for a body he personally knew had already washed out to the ocean. His performance was entirely devoid of the micro-expressions of guilt that usually betray a killer. He spoke with local media outlets, providing poignant quotes about her infectious laugh and her artistic talent, weaponizing his long history with her to validate his fabricated grief. He suggested to anyone who would listen that perhaps she really had buckled under the weight of her depression, subtly reinforcing the police's initial theory. He actively steered the narrative, planting careful seeds of doubt to ensure the investigative focus remained squarely on the river and far away from his own apartment. His roommate mirrored this chilling sociopathy. He participated in the very searches he knew were utterly futile. He watched community volunteers weep over a tragedy that he had facilitated for a meager cut of stolen cash. They both operated in broad daylight, surrounded by law enforcement and grieving relatives, absolutely confident in their own untouchability. But the river's persistent refusal to surrender a body began to create a localized friction. The physical reality of the waterways presented a severe logistical problem for the suicide theory. The tides in that specific inlet were strong, but the basin was enclosed enough that recovery teams usually located jump victims within a predictable radius. A human form hitting the water from that height would likely have snagged on the submerged concrete pylons or washed up along the immediate shoreline within a week. The total, prolonged absence of physical evidence slowly eroded the certainty of a fatal leap. Paranoia began to circulate. The faded flyers on the utility poles took on a more sinister context. The community, initially united in a rescue effort, started to fracture under the weight of unanswerable questions. If the freezing water hadn't taken her, the only remaining alternative was that someone on land had. The father refused to let the momentum die. He organized a massive volunteer search at a nearby state park, drawing hundreds of locals who spent their weekends trudging through dense, frozen brush. The mastermind attended that search too. He stood in a wide circle of shivering volunteers, bowing his head respectfully during a moment of silent prayer, a predator resting comfortably among the flock. He was simply waiting for the calendar to turn, waiting for the town's energy to deplete, entirely certain that the truth was buried under 50 feet of dark water and a perfectly executed lie. Without a body, a secondary crime scene, or a hostile witness, the detectives were forced to navigate an agonizing maze of dead ends. They pulled financial records, searching for sudden bank withdrawals or transportation ticket purchases that might suggest the 19-year-old had successfully executed her cross-country escape. The accounts were entirely dormant. They analyzed cellular tower pings, but the data only confirmed her phone went dead near the bridge. The investigative team conducted routine, procedural interviews with the victim's inner circle. The childhood friend who had aggressively helped coordinate the civilian search parties sat across from seasoned interrogators and delivered a flawless, practiced performance. He offered them the exact narrative they were already leaning toward, painting a highly believable portrait of a grieving daughter who simply cracked under the relentless psychological weight of her mother's death. He maintained steady eye contact. He controlled his breathing. The detectives filed his statement without a second thought. He was documented as a highly cooperative witness, an asset to the inquiry, rather than a target. The investigation essentially stalled, frozen in the winter ice. The pivotal breakthrough did not come from advanced forensic analysis or a sudden shift in the ocean currents. It came from a delayed crisis of conscience. In late January 2017, nearly 2 months after the idling Oldsmobile was found, a local 19-year-old named Anthony Curry walked into a police precinct. He was an amateur filmmaker, known around the borough for producing independent horror shorts. He carried a heavy, terrifying burden. He explained to the detectives that weeks prior to the disappearance, he had engaged in a casual conversation with an acquaintance. The acquaintance had pitched what sounded like a gritty script idea for a new movie. The concept involved a plot to strangle a wealthy female friend, steal a heavy lockbox filled with inherited cash, and stage the aftermath by throwing the body off the Route 35 bridge to simulate a suicide. At the time, the filmmaker assumed it was just macabre creative brainstorming. He brushed it off as dark fiction. But when the exact, highly specific parameters of that pitch manifested in reality, the theoretical horror morphed into undeniable panic. He gave the authorities the name of the aspiring screenwriter. It was the same helpful, grieving friend who had been handing out missing person flyers at the local diners. Detectives recognized the extreme fragility of the situation. A bizarre conversation about a hypothetical movie plot was entirely circumstantial. It was not sufficient for a murder indictment, especially in a jurisdiction operating without a corpse. They needed the predator to voluntarily incriminate himself on the record, completely unaware that his audience had changed. The investigative team approached the filmmaker and proposed a high-risk sting operation. They needed him to act as human bait. On January 31st, technicians meticulously rigged the informant's personal vehicle with concealed, high-definition audiovisual recording equipment. Pinhole lenses were embedded into the dashboard and the interior upholstery, capturing every possible angle of the passenger seat. Microphones were calibrated to cut through engine noise and pick up the faintest whispers. The informant was instructed to invite the target into the car under the guise of catching up, to drive aimlessly around the dark coastal streets, and to subtly steer the conversation toward the missing girl. The psychological pressure on the young informant was immense. He had to sit mere inches away from a man he now believed was a calculating killer, maintaining a relaxed, casual demeanor while transmitting audio directly to a nearby surveillance van packed with federal agents. The target opened the passenger door and slid into the wired vehicle. The trap was set. What the detectives heard over the live feed over the next hour was a masterclass in detached sociopathy. The suspect did not need to be aggressively prodded or skillfully interrogated. He wanted to brag. He viewed the murder not as a horrific moral transgression, but as a supreme logistical triumph. He was deeply proud of his operational genius, and he was eager to share the mechanics of his success with someone he considered a creative peer. Over the hidden microphones, investigators listened in stunned silence as the young man systematically dismantled his own alibi. He provided the gruesome, granular details of the afternoon ambush. He described the exact 30-minute duration he had monitored on his phone while he applied the chokehold in her living room. He detailed the victim's frantic, desperate struggle, noting with absolute coldness how the family dog had barked chaotically in the background. The audio feed captured him complaining about the sheer physical exertion required to drag a dead weight out the back door and shove it into the frozen dirt. He casually outlined how his roommate had monitored the walkie-talkie and helped haul the corpse onto the concrete span of the bridge. But the psychological core of the confession was not guilt. It was profound financial grievance. He complained bitterly to the informant that the massive payout he had anticipated was a total mirage. The heavy steel safe did not contain the estimated $100,000 he had calculated. The total yield barely broke $10,000. Adding to his intense frustration, the vintage bills were in terrible condition, sticky, brittle, and smelling of mildew. He admitted to burning a large portion of the older currency in a fire pit because he feared the outdated serial numbers would flag suspicion at the local bank tellers. He had snapped the neck of his closest childhood friend, destroyed multiple families, and risked a lethal injection, all for a few $1,000s in decaying, unusable paper. He actually laughed through the dashboard speakers, remarking on the bitter irony of the poor payout and mocking the victim for not fighting back harder during her execution. The detective sitting in the surveillance van had heard enough. The meticulous, grieving friend facade was permanently shattered on digital tape. The administrative paperwork for a double arrest was initiated before the suspect even stepped out of the wired car. The arrests were executed simultaneously. Faced with the overwhelming weight of the surveillance tape, the subordinate immediately fractured. He accepted a plea agreement, formally turning state's evidence in exchange for a capped prison term of 18 years. He physically guided detectives back to the precise locations of the ambush and the bridge, confirming every terrifying logistical detail captured on the wire, though the ocean never returned the physical evidence. The 2019 legal proceedings presented a notoriously difficult hurdle for prosecutors, securing a homicide conviction without a corpse. The defense attorneys attempted a massive pivot. They argued the dashboard confession was nothing more than an elaborate, fabricated audition tape, a dark performance piece created specifically for the informant's upcoming film project. It was a desperate strategy that completely collapsed the moment the jury heard the audio. The sheer, banal cruelty of the defendant's voice resonating through the courtroom, complaining about the degraded quality of the vintage bills while casually verifying the stopwatch timing of the strangulation, eliminated all reasonable doubt. He was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, and permanently removed from society with a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The Shark River never surrendered the physical remains to the tide, but the lasting horror of this case does not rest in the freezing currents or an empty steel lockbox. It resides in those final, suffocating minutes on a living room floor. She did not perish fighting off an anonymous intruder in the dark. She spent her last conscious moments staring into the eyes of the boy who had sworn to protect her, dying with the profound realization that her survival meant absolutely nothing to him. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.